Everywhere he goes, President Joe Biden is talking to people these days about his intention to run for re-election in 2024. The problem is, polls show that almost nobody wants that, and almost nobody seems to be listening to him. Let's talk. For the past several years, conservatives have been chided by Democrats anytime we suggest that because of the numerous missteps and flubs and other bizarre behaviors that come from Joe Biden, that the president might be too old to do the job that he's been given. What's interesting is, in recent weeks, not only prominent Democrats, but also the mainstream media is beginning to suggest what conservatives have been saying for a long time. One of the challenges to conservatives is people on the left always say, well, Ronald Reagan was an old president and you love Ronald Reagan. But the fact of the matter is, Ronald Reagan was younger when he left office after his second term than Joe Biden was when he came into office for his first term. We've never had a president anywhere close to the age of this president. And the problem is he's starting to show the signs of his age. There was an article last weekend in the New York Times, sort of the mouthpiece newspaper in America for the Democratic Party. Peter Baker, a journalist who does not wake up in the morning trying to insult the president, he wrote these words, speaking about his interviews with White House staffers. Speaking about the president, he said, he often shuffles when he walks, and aides worry he will trip on a wire. He stumbles over words during public events, and they hold their breath to see if he makes it to the end without a gaffe. His speeches can be flat and listless. He sometimes loses his train of thought, has trouble summoning names, or appears momentarily confused. Folks, especially coming from a left-leaning journalist, that is both a sad and crushing statement. The New York Times tells us that Biden has just a 33% job approval rating, with 64% of registered Democrats who do not want him to seek a second term. CNN, another left-leaning news organization, reports that the White House is filled with dysfunction. In fact, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg and California Governor Gavin Newsom are crisscrossing the country right now, visiting important battleground states, almost as though they're already running for president. President Biden, according to Democrats, had one job: defeat President Trump. Through whatever ways that you may think that happened, it happened. But now he presides over the worst American economy since Jimmy Carter. And the fact of the matter is, most of the problems that this president's administration faces are self-inflicted. Do you remember? The pledge was, as he was coming to the day of inauguration, his staff said that the time of chaos was past, that the adults were in charge now, and if President Biden could only do one thing, it would be this: he would bring normality back to the White House. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to normality. President Biden, over the last year and a half, has had one bizarre escapade after another as he has crashed his presidency into the rocks of incompetence, tone deafness, and stubbornly misplaced priorities. Most of the disasters of this administration have been self-inflicted, while the president spends a lot of time explaining to us that everything that's wrong in America is somebody else's fault. It's not just oil companies, it's actually gas station owners that are to blame. It's Russia, it's never China, but there's always somebody else at fault. I find it interesting why anybody would want to run for a position that we typically refer to as the most powerful man on earth, and then get into that position only to claim that his hands are always tied and there's really nothing he can do to make things different. Which is it? Can a president set direction and make a difference in the lives of average Americans? Or is this an empty suit who just sits in a funny-shaped office and does nothing? Well, his staff regularly these days has to walk back statements that the president makes in his speeches. In fact, they say things like, well, that didn't come across exactly the way he meant it, but the president wasn't speaking off the cuff. He was simply revealing his own views on the subject. And they say the president is allowed to speak his mind on whatever subject he wants to talk about. The problem is, the way they say it sounds disturbingly like they're patting an old man on his head and condescendingly telling other people to not take anything he says too seriously. This is the President of the United States. He promised us that he would produce normality. Yeah, well, it's not normal for a president to misspeak so routinely that it almost seems strange when he gets it right. It's not normal for a president to shovel trillions of dollars into a growing economy and then still want to spend trillions more when it's clear that inflation is out of control. It's not normal for a president to suppress U.S. energy production at the same time that he begs nations in the Middle East to produce more and sell it to us. It's not normal for a president to open the floodgates for illegal migration at the southern border and then pretend that if he doesn't use the word crisis, then somehow it's not a crisis. It's not normal for a president to abandon Americans in a foreign country after the withdrawal of U.S. troops against the advice of his generals, leading to hostile forces rapidly sweeping into power in the very spaces that we vacated. It's not normal for a president's son to become a multi-millionaire drug user because of the money that he gets being a part of a company that is in the back pocket of the Chinese Communist Party. It's not normal for a first-term president to be on the verge of becoming a lame duck because nobody believes that he can make it to 2024 to run again, and even if he does, most Democrats don't want him to. He hasn't even given us average leadership. In a recent speech, he actually repeated the instructions on the teleprompter. It said, "Repeat the line," and he read, "Repeat the line." One prominent Twitter account suggested that the real president of the United States is whoever controls the teleprompter. Joe Biden is a politician with mediocre credentials and minimal accomplishments in his career. There is concern that he is mentally unaware of real-world circumstances. There's concern that he is ill-informed on the daily experiences of average Americans. And there's concern that he is being manipulated by unelected staffers who are pushing a radical agenda. Well, what do? How do we think about this biblically? Well, the comparison that comes to my mind was the first king of Israel, a man by the name of Saul, a man who came into the role of king with all kinds of promise. He looked the part. He had the credentials. Everybody in Israel thought that he was the perfect man for the job, only to find out that as soon as he was in power, Saul immediately began to turn away from the Lord, and his reign as king, his administration, if you will, was marked by one foolish act after another that spread out over his entire life. He issued commands that harmed his own people. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, we find that he disobeyed a direct order from God to destroy an enemy. Saul was perpetually paranoid about opponents. He was scared to death of a young man named David because God was with him. In 1 Samuel 18, we find that fear being put on display. 2 times Saul tried to kill David with a spear, and later he conspired with other people to try and kill David through them. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, he even tries to kill his own son Jonathan, who he is paranoid about having a divided loyalty and being more faithful to David than to Saul. He killed Levitical priests during his reign as king. He wasted years not building up the nation of Israel, but promoting his own personal vendetta against David. By the end of his life, completely forgetting that he stood accountable to God, he debased himself by consulting a medium. 1 Samuel chapter 28. That's outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 18 as a specific prohibition from God. Eventually, Saul dies in 1 Samuel 31. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, we read the summary of Saul's reign as king over Israel. It says, "So Saul died for his unfaithfulness which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of her, and did not inquire of the Lord." You see, Saul was the victim of his own faulty leadership. His wounds were primarily not political, they were self-inflicted. This president is facing a world of problems, but many of them are the direct result of decisions that he made, sometimes within the first 5 or 6 hours following his inauguration. So what do? How do we biblically approach this? We, in a sense, to use this biblical comparison, we have a king who is a danger to himself, and more than that, a danger to the people that he is accountable to God to look for. You say, well, accountable to God, the United States president is not the king of Israel. The U.S. is not Israel. I understand that. But the reality is the Bible teaches us that every political ruler, everyone who is given responsibility for a nation of citizens, whether they recognize it or not, they stand accountable to God. And in a nation with the Judeo-Christian background and foundation of the United States, the U.S. president has a great deal of responsibility in acknowledging that he is accountable to God for his leadership. You say, well, we have the most religious president that we've ever had. You know, I hear that from the mainstream media all the time. Joe's a good Catholic. He goes to Mass all the time. Listen, Joe's not a good Catholic. Joe doesn't even believe Catholic theology. The Archbishop of San Francisco just put Nancy Pelosi on notice that he will prevent her, when she goes home to California, from receiving the Eucharist, the Catholic Mass, because of her radical pro-abortion viewpoints. Well, if the number 2 Democrat in America is qualified to receive sanctions from the Catholic Church, certainly the number 1 Democrat in America qualifies as well. He's not in step with his church. He's certainly not in step with a God who takes life seriously and views it sacredly. You say, but Pastor, the New Testament tells us that we're supposed to pray for those who are in authority over us. Yes, it does. And that's what I'm going to suggest. You need to pray for the President of the United States. But I want you to understand what that means. When I was a young parent and had small children, from early on in the raising of my children, one of the prayers that I used to pray for them was, Lord, please protect them from the opportunities to do things from which they cannot recover. Protect them from the opportunity to make decisions that they can never come back from, to do something so stupid that their whole life will be set on a trajectory, will be set on a course that they can't recover from. You want to know what I'm praying for Joe Biden on a daily basis? I'm not praying for him to be removed, for the 25th Amendment to be kicked in. We are in such a bizarre situation in this country. We have a president who probably shouldn't be president, but all of the alternatives around him are actually worse. I'm not praying that he'll be removed. I'm praying this: Lord, protect the president and American citizens. Protect us from the president having any opportunity to do yet one more thing that our country might never be able to recover from. It is a legitimate prayer for us to pray that God limits the ability of this presidential administration to do any further damage to the nation that we're a part of. Well, preacher, why are you involved in politics? Because politics is an expression of who we are as a nation. This is not a dictatorship. This is a representative republic. And it is my responsibility to speak truth to power, to be engaged in the civic process, and to ask for God's intervention in this generation. Lord, protect this president, but keep him from any opportunity to do damage from which we may not recover. That is a way that you can pray for those who are in authority over us. This is Truth Currents.